The blood-soaked truth. 4 slave rebellions wiped from history. The blood still stained the cobblestones of Charleston's meeting street when the carriages began to roll. It was July 2nd, 1822, and 35 bodies swayed in the humid morning air. Denmark Vesey's head hung motionless as the crowds below dispersed into silence. But what happened next would shock you more than the executions themselves. By nightfall, every document, every testimony, every trace of what had truly unfolded was disappearing into locked vaults and midnight fires. This wasn't just execution. This was erasure. What you're about to discover represents one of the most comprehensive campaigns of historical suppression ever conducted on American soil. 4 pivotal uprisings that shook the foundations of slavery so violently that authorities launched a centuries-long conspiracy to wipe them from memory. But here's what they never counted on. The truth has a way of surviving. And what emerges from newly uncovered documents, suppressed testimonies, and systematic investigation is a dark revelation that will rewrite everything you thought you knew about American history. The impossible silence. Charleston, South Carolina. Summer of 1822. The city should have been echoing with the sounds of the most extensive slave conspiracy in American history. Instead, an eerie quiet had descended. Court records began vanishing. Witnesses fell silent. And a story that should have terrified the entire South was being methodically erased from existence. Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter who had won his freedom through a lottery, had spent 4 years building what authorities called the most sophisticated slave rebellion ever planned. Over 1,000 free and enslaved people were allegedly involved. The conspiracy stretched from Charleston's wharfs to plantations 50 miles inland. It had international connections to Haiti, sophisticated communication networks, and detailed military plans that would have seized control of America's 4th largest city. Yet within months, it was as if it had never happened. Thomas Hamilton, Charleston's intendant, wrote in his private journal, "The trial records must be secured from public view permanently. The scale of organization revealed cannot be allowed to inspire similar acts elsewhere." These words wouldn't see daylight for nearly 2 centuries. But Hamilton's journal, discovered in 2010 during renovation of a Charleston mansion, revealed the calculated nature of what was being hidden. The systematic suppression began immediately. Court transcripts were declared classified. Witnesses were forbidden from discussing testimony. Newspaper coverage was heavily censored, with editors instructed to emphasize black barbarism while minimizing the rebellion's organization and scale. The few accounts that survived painted the conspiracy as the ravings of a few fanatics rather than the coordinated resistance movement it actually represented. But here's what the suppressors couldn't have anticipated. Some evidence would survive. And what it reveals about the true scale of these rebellions will leave you questioning everything you were taught about American slavery. The Prophet's Vision. Southampton County, Virginia, August 21st, 1831. The darkness was absolute when Nat Turner raised his hatchet above the sleeping form of Joseph Travis, the man who claimed to own him. Turner had seen signs in the heavens, a solar eclipse, the sun appearing blue-green through atmospheric disturbance. To Turner, these were divine commands to begin what he called the work of death. What followed would become known as the deadliest slave rebellion in American history. But what you haven't been told is how systematically the aftermath was covered up. Turner's rebellion lasted 36 hours. His force grew from 7 trusted conspirators to over 70 followers as they moved from plantation to plantation. 57 white men, women, and children were killed before militias and federal troops crushed the uprising. Turner himself remained hidden for 10 weeks, surviving in swamps and caves while the largest manhunt in Virginia history pursued him. But the real horror wasn't the rebellion itself. It was what happened next. In the immediate aftermath, white militias and mobs killed between 120 to 300 enslaved people and free African Americans, more than 5 times the number killed in the actual rebellion. The violence was both random and ritualized, designed to terrorize entire communities into permanent submission. Heads were severed and mounted on poles along major roadways. Virginia State Route 658, still bears the name Blackhead Signpost Road from those gruesome displays. Turner's wife Cherry was beaten and tortured for weeks in attempts to locate her husband. Her testimony, extracted under the lash according to the Richmond Constitutional Whig, revealed papers hidden in their cabin. But Cherry's own words about the torture she endured were never recorded in any official document. Her voice, like so many others, was silenced forever. When Turner was finally captured on October 30th, local attorney Thomas Gray approached him with what seemed like a historical opportunity, recording Turner's own account of events. But Gray was drowning in debt and saw Turner's story as a path to quick cash. Modern scholars have identified numerous discrepancies in Turner's supposed language throughout the Confessions of Nat Turner, suggesting Gray's agenda fundamentally shaped what became the official, historical record. Turner's actual voice was filtered through a biased intermediary with financial motives. His real words, his true motivations, his authentic spiritual convictions, all were distorted by a man who viewed him as a commodity rather than a human being. The result was a document that satisfied white audiences' need to see Turner as a deranged fanatic rather than a religious leader fighting oppression. But what survived in oral tradition tells a different story. Turner's religious convictions were profound and systematic. Even filtered through Gray's bias, Turner's words convey unwavering spiritual certainty. And now the Holy Ghost had revealed itself to me and made plain the miracles it had shown me. For as the blood of Christ had been shed on this earth and had ascended to heaven for the salvation of sinners and was now returning to earth again in the form of dew, Turner described receiving divine command through celestial signs. And on the appearance of the sign, the eclipse of the sun last February, I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. Even facing execution, Turner showed no remorse, reportedly responding, "Was not Christ crucified?" when asked if he found himself mistaken. After his execution on November 11th, Turner's body was desecrated in ways that revealed the depth of white terror at what he represented. His corpse was dissected and flayed, the skin used to make souvenir purses for white collectors. His skull became a trophy passed between Virginia families. Even death could not end the symbolic violence required to neutralize the threat Turner represented. The conspiracy that may never have existed. But perhaps the most shocking suppression of all involves Denmark Vesey's alleged conspiracy in Charleston. Recent historical analysis suggests something almost unbelievable, that authorities may have manufactured the entire plot to justify massive repression. Historian Michael P. Johnson's analysis of the trial records revealed systematic torture in Charleston's workhouse, where suspects were abused or threatened with abuse or death before giving testimony. Most testimony came from witnesses under tremendous pressure in secret proceedings, with the court itself noting it found it difficult to get conclusive evidence. The supposed conspiracy unraveled under scrutiny. No arms caches were ever discovered. No written plans were found. No coordinated signals or meetings were documented beyond hearsay testimony extracted under torture. The evidence consisted entirely of testimony from terrorized men who had been promised leniency in exchange for implicating others. Some historians now argue the conspiracy was largely angry talk rather than an actual plot, that authorities created a crisis to justify collective punishment of Charleston's free black community. The timing was suspiciously convenient. The conspiracy was discovered just as South Carolina was debating legislation to restrict free black movement and assembly. Yet the suppression campaign proceeded as if the conspiracy had been genuine. 35 men were executed. 37 more were sold outside the state. Charleston's African Methodist Episcopal Church, which boasted over 3,000 members, was permanently closed. New laws required all free black people to have white guardians. The Citadel was established to house a permanent military force of 150 guards. If the conspiracy was manufactured, then the suppression efforts reveal something even more disturbing, that authorities were willing to execute dozens of innocent men to maintain social control. The systematic erasure of evidence wasn't covering up a rebellion, it was covering up a massacre. The march toward freedom But not all the rebellions were conspiracies or brief uprisings. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 reveals what organized slave resistance could accomplish when it had clear goals and military leadership. Early Sunday morning, September 9th, 1739. 20 enslaved Africans met near the Stono River, 20 miles southwest of Charleston. These weren't desperate field hands acting on impulse. They were Congolese warriors who had been captured during civil wars and sold into slavery. Many spoke Portuguese and had been exposed to Christianity in Africa, making them aware of Spanish Florida's offer of freedom to escaped slaves. The rebellion began with military precision. The rebels broke into Hutchinson's store, armed themselves with guns and powder, and killed the 2 storekeepers. But rather than random violence, they showed remarkable discipline. When they reached a tavern, they spared the innkeeper because he was known to be kind to his slaves. They burned houses belonging to cruel masters while leaving others untouched. With cries of liberty and beating of drums, according to historian Peter H. Wood, the rebels raised a standard and headed south toward Spanish Street Augustine. As they marched, they gathered black recruits and displayed banners while maintaining organized formations. This wasn't a mob. It was an army. The rebels covered 15 miles before being intercepted by hastily assembled militias. The final battle was fierce, with the Congolese warriors fighting with skills learned in African conflicts. Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who first spotted the rebel column, later wrote that they fought with the courage of their homeland, dying like soldiers rather than slaves. The suppression was immediate and brutal. Heads were severed and mounted on poles along major roadways to serve as warnings. But the aftermath revealed how profoundly the rebellion had shaken the colonial system. South Carolina immediately imposed a 10-year moratorium on slave imports from the Congo-Angola region. The Negro Act of 1740 required a ratio of 1 white to 10 blacks on any plantation and mandated that white men carry arms even to church. Yet despite these massive changes to colonial law, the Stono Rebellion virtually disappeared from historical memory. Colonial records were deliberately vague about the scale of organization. The military skills displayed by the rebels were downplayed. Their connection to international networks of resistance was hidden. Instead, official accounts portrayed the rebellion as a spontaneous outburst rather than the planned military operation it actually represented. The revolution that succeeded. The most systematic suppression involved the one rebellion that actually succeeded, the Haitian Revolution. Beginning in 1791, enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue launched the only successful slave revolution in history. Yet American textbooks barely mention it, and when they do, they systematically minimize its significance. The revolution began with Boukman's revolutionary prayer at the Bois Cayman ceremony, preserved in oral tradition. The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light. You see all that the white man has made us suffer. The white man's God asks him to commit crimes, but the God within us wants to do good. Our God, who is so good, so just, he orders us to revenge our wrongs. What followed was 13 years of warfare that defeated French, Spanish, and British armies. The revolutionaries, led by Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, created the world's first black republic and the second independent nation in the Americas. They abolished slavery and established a constitution guaranteeing equal rights regardless of race. The revolution's success sent shockwaves through every slaveholding society. Saint-Domingue had been the most profitable colony in the world, producing 2/3 of global coffee and generating enormous wealth for French planters, merchants, and the colonial government. The successful revolution threatened the fundamental economic model of the Atlantic world. International suppression began immediately. The United States refused to recognize Haitian independence until 1862, treating the nation as a pariah state. France forced Haiti to pay 150 million gold francs in reparations to former slaveholders in 1825. Bankrupting the new nation for generations. European powers coordinated diplomatic and economic isolation designed to ensure Haiti's failure. But the intellectual suppression was even more comprehensive. The Haitian Declaration of Independence remained hidden for more than 200 years among private papers until its discovery in 2010. All copies of the official government-issued document had mysteriously disappeared from public view in the decades following the revolution. American textbooks systematically erased Haiti's role in shaping world history. Napoleon's loss of Saint-Domingue led directly to the Louisiana Purchase, doubling U.S. territory. The revolution inspired resistance movements throughout the Americas and Europe. It proved that enslaved people could overthrow their oppressors and govern themselves successfully. Yet this world-changing event was reduced to footnotes in American education or eliminated entirely. The message was clear. Successful slave rebellion could not be allowed to inspire future resistance. The architecture of erasure. The systematic suppression of these rebellions reveals the sophisticated methods authorities used to control historical memory. Document destruction was comprehensive and deliberate. Court records were not simply lost over time but actively destroyed to prevent future generations from learning the truth. Many documents were destroyed during Sherman's march through the South, but historians now suspect much destruction was intentional rather than collateral damage. Archives were selectively purged of materials relating to slave resistance while preserving records supporting plantation mythology. Legal systems were manipulated to ensure predetermined outcomes while maintaining the appearance of due process. Virginia's formal trial procedures after Turner's rebellion were designed primarily to guarantee state compensation to slaveholders rather than ensure justice. Charleston's secret proceedings for the Vesey conspiracy prevented public scrutiny of evidence and testimony. Media censorship extended from immediate suppression to long-term historical revision. Southern states passed laws restricting press freedom that was said to be encouraging slave rebellion. Editors like Reverend Elijah Lovejoy were killed by mobs for printing abolitionist content. Southern states began withholding abolitionist mail to prevent circulation of materials that might inspire resistance. The long-term campaign proved even more effective than immediate censorship. The United Daughters of the Confederacy established the Rutherford History Committee in 1919, creating a measuring rod to test textbooks that guided Southern educators to reject any textbook portraying slavery accurately. Virginia's History and Textbook Commission of the 1950s deliberately imposed lost cause narratives, describing enslaved people as having found homes and friends and hailed their entrance into slavery with joy. Modern textbook suppression continues this tradition. McGraw-Hill's 2015 World Geography textbook referred to enslaved Africans as workers, brought through patterns of immigration, completely sanitizing the violence of forced enslavement. The Southern Poverty Law Center's 2018 Teaching Hard History report found that only 54% of teachers cover slavery's continuing legacy, while none of the reviewed textbooks made meaningful connections between slavery and present-day structural racism. The hidden evidence. Recent scholarship has uncovered extensive evidence revealing the full scope of suppression efforts. Court records show torture was routinely used to extract confessions and testimony, with suspects held in facilities like Charleston's workhouse where they were subjected to systematic abuse. Many witnesses provided testimony only after being promised leniency or following solitary confinement and other torture. Scholar Michael P. Johnson's comparison of different versions of Denmark Vesey's trial records found numerous discrepancies, suggesting official reports were edited to serve political purposes rather than preserve historical accuracy. Documents were not simply lost over time, but actively destroyed to prevent future generations from learning the full truth. The scope of surveillance and control extended far beyond immediate participants to entire communities. Legal requirements mandated that whites carry arms to church, report suspicious activity, and participate in patrols, creating community-wide surveillance systems that made organized resistance extremely difficult. These systems became models for later oppression throughout the Jim Crow era and beyond. Digital archives are now making previously inaccessible primary sources widely available for the first time, allowing researchers to uncover evidence successfully suppressed for generations. Contemporary efforts to reclaim these suppressed histories face ongoing resistance from the same forces that originally orchestrated their erasure. The revolutionary threat that still terrifies. The fact that these stories continue to generate controversy and political resistance more than 2 centuries later testifies to their enduring revolutionary potential. Recent legislation in multiple states restricts teaching about slavery's contemporary impacts, continuing the tradition of educational censorship that began immediately after these rebellions. The comprehensive nature of the suppression efforts spanning document destruction, witness intimidation, media censorship, educational manipulation, cultural erasure, and psychological warfare demonstrates that these rebellions succeeded in ways traditional measures of success cannot capture. They forced fundamental changes in legal systems, political structures, international relations, and cultural narratives that persist to this day. Most significantly, these rebellions reveal enslaved people were never passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation struggles. Their resistance efforts, even when unsuccessful in immediate terms, contributed to broader political and economic pressures that eventually made slavery untenable. The courage they demonstrated in facing certain death, the sophisticated planning they undertook despite surveillance and oppression, and the spiritual conviction that sustained them through torture and execution, provide powerful examples of human agency under dehumanizing conditions. Nat Turner's unwavering conviction that divine justice demanded action. Denmark Vesey's biblical arguments for liberation, whether real or manufactured by authorities desperate for justification. The Stono rebels' determination to be men rather than property. Boukman's revolutionary prayer that sparked the only successful slave revolution in history. These voices, long silenced by systematic suppression, finally speak again through recovered documents, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence. They reveal truths about American history that remain as challenging and necessary today as they were when authorities first sought to erase them from memory. The blood may have dried on Charleston's cobblestones, but the truth they tried so desperately to bury has finally clawed its way back to the surface. And what it reveals about the systematic suppression of slave resistance will forever change how we understand not just American history, but the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and human dignity. Their rebellion was not just against chains, but against the very idea that human beings could be owned. Their legacy is not just in the courage they showed, but in the desperate efforts to hide that courage from future generations. The systematic erasure of their stories represents not just the suppression of facts, but the deliberate concealment of a tradition of resistance that continues to threaten systems of oppression today. That's why they worked so hard to erase these stories. That's why they destroyed the documents, tortured the witnesses, and rewrote the history books. Because they understood something that mainstream history has consistently underestimated. These rebellions represented not isolated outbursts of violence, but sophisticated challenges to the fundamental premises of racial oppression and economic exploitation. And in the end, that's what still terrifies those in power. Not just what these rebels did, but what their memory might inspire others to do. The revolution, it turns out, was never really suppressed. It was just hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows and reclaim its place in history. The truth, as it always does, has found a way to survive.